Hi, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. I'm your host, Phil, and I'm joined today by John Doyle, as always. And it's Alumni Day here on the ShopNotes Podcast. We have special guest Randy Maxey. Today's episode, we'll talk about what Randy's been up to and a couple of books that he's been working on and written. I want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Shaper Tools, makers of the Shaper Origin, the handheld CNC router that brings digital precision to the craft of woodworking. You can tackle joinery, cabinetry, hardware installation, and more with both speed and precision. Try it risk-free in your shop for 30 days. Visit shapertools.com to learn more. All right, it's my pleasure to welcome sort of back to the podcast here, Randy Maxey, who was a longtime editor for both Woodsmith and ShopNotes Magazine. Randy has published several woodworking books since his time here and also worked with a tool manufacturer. And he's just got a fun story to tell, so we thought we'd catch up with him and see what he's been up to. So that's my introduction for you, Randy. What else would you want to say?
Well, I mean, it's like a reunion for Woodsmith here. It's good to see all you guys.
Yeah, Randy and I worked on reader's tips together in ShopNotes Magazine. It was probably 10, 15 years ago, and I'm still doing reader's tips for Woodsmith Magazine. And
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And Randy was able to graduate.
Yep. He's moved on and living a good life. So.
Yeah, I've been probably as busy as you guys are with everything you've got going on there. Finally got some shop space after going for about 5 years, just kind of hobbling along. And so my new shop area is right behind the Tampa airport, which makes for some interesting noises when we're trying to record video. So, yeah, the planes like to take off and land directly across our top of our building. So it's challenging at times. But
I'm sure.
Anyway, it's good to be back in my own space and been doing a lot of writing and kind of anxious to get back to building some projects.
Yeah. Anything you have on your list?
Nothing specific at this point. I know we talked about, my publisher and I have talked about doing a book on joinery, and I'm trying to figure out if I want to incorporate a project or two or three in that,
Sure.
Show practical uses for it. But we're still in the idea stages for that, so we haven't gotten too far with it yet.
So speaking of your books, I know that you've been involved with two of them. You want to describe them a little bit?
Well, the first one that I was actually involved with was outdoor games. It was kind of an interesting project that we had all these ideas to come up with these easy to build games for outdoors that a DIYer or a beginning woodworker could put together and have some fun in their backyard. And for me, it was kind of a change because I'm used to the Woodsmith ShopNotes style of woodworking where you're building fine furniture or shop jigs or whatever. And now I'm working with plywood and 2x4s and just screwing stuff together and making it functional, which is, what our target audience wants. And the book has been doing very well. The second book was called Woodworking Basics. Was kind of a fun one to work on. And it was a challenge too, because we decided at the outset that we weren't going to use any power tools on the projects in that book. And so when I went into the shop, it was like, okay, how am I going to do this operation without a table saw, without a bandsaw, without a router? So I would literally stand there and look at what I have to do and try to figure out a way that the average beginning woodworker or a homeowner or a DIYer would go about accomplishing that joinery and building that project. And it was quite the challenge, but I think we hit all the good points, and that book seems to be doing fairly well as well. And then the latest one I've worked on is it's called Sharpening, a Woodworker's Guide. Sometimes when you write a book, your idea of what the book should be and what the publisher's idea of what the book should be are two different things. So they wanted me to cover a broad spectrum of sharpening, including gardening tools and kitchen tools and all this stuff. And, it was a challenge to put all that together and try to present it in a way that, again, the beginner or, the DIYer could pick up a tool and, purchase the appropriate equipment to sharpen that tool and show them the proper techniques. And in some areas we kind of, I think we did very well. In other areas, you look back on the printed book after it's all done and you go, man, I could have done that a little better, or a little different. So, but it's a good overall general purpose book on sharpening, and covers techniques and the different supplies you would need and can use for sharpening your tools.
Yeah. So did you learn anything about sharpening in the process of writing the book, or learn anything about teaching sharpening?
Well, I've always suspected, and it was proven through the book, that you ask 100 woodworkers how to sharpen a chisel, you'll get 100 different answers because the materials and the techniques all vary. Some, like myself, I prefer to sharpen freehand. And, I show that technique in the book, but I also show using a honing guide, and setting the proper angles. And we talk about cutting angles and bevel angles and all that. So, it was just kind of amazing to me, the broad selection of materials that you can purchase to get a sharp edge on a tool, from water stones, the diamond stones, oil stones, sandpaper, you name it, it's out there. And I tried to touch on a lot of those. And then there are the variety of tools that the tool manufacturers want you to feature. Our gizmo and our guide are the, be all end all for sharpening. And, you take a look at them and you try to see where they fit. And are they appropriate for somebody that's just starting out and wanting to learn sharpening? So, it was quite the task to try to boil everything down. It's not an exhaustive thesis on, like Mr. Lee's book on sharpening or Mr. Hawk's book on sharpening. It's just a basic, here are some things you can buy, here are some techniques you can use to get a sharp edge on whatever it is you're sharpening. A pair of scissors or a kitchen knife or pocket knife or a chisel or a hand plane, any of that. So it was quite the challenge to get that all done. And, I shoot my own photography, I do my own illustrations, plus do the writing. So,
wow.
Add that on top of, just doing the writing, and it was quite the process.
How long did it take to put that together all?
I'm going to say probably a good 5 to 6 months.
Oh yeah.
Get it all together.
I would imagine, one of the things that, we struggle with as magazine writers that I'm sure you deal with in a book is the fine line between being descriptive and instructional, and yet knowing that sharpening, along with a lot of woodworking skills, is kind of a journey.
That's correct.
Because I'm sure that your sharpening approach now is different than it was 10 years ago, right?
Oh, absolutely. When I first started out, really the only sharpening medium I could afford was wet dry sandpaper. and I had a piece of glass, and I, put my sandpaper down, and I went through the grits, and I didn't even have a honing guide. I was trying to do it freehand, and I had a lot of failures before I finally figured out what I was doing wrong. And I used wet dry sandpaper for a lot of years. Then I graduated to diamond stones.
Sure.
And now I've got a broad selection of ceramic waterstones, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. So it depends on what your needs are and what your budget is, really.
Yeah.
And the one thing is, no matter what technique you show or what equipment you show, somebody's always going to claim they have a better way, and you just, as a writer and an author, I have to, look beyond that and just do what I know how to do. And that was the agreement I had with the publisher. I could show, the techniques I use. If somebody disagrees with that, but their technique works for them, that's great. Mm-hmm. But here's how I do it. And
right.
That's kind of the process and the thought process I went through with the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think so.
Sharpening is definitely one of those things that you kind of have to find out the technique that works for you and that you're going to do consistently and go with that, even though there's lots of different ways. So
I did a presentation in front of one of the woodworking clubs here in Florida and brought up the subject of sharpening. And I asked for a show of hands how many feel comfortable sharpening, and not many hands went up. And so I asked, what's the issue that prevents you from, getting comfortable with the aspect of sharpening a chisel or a plane iron? And, the one guy brought up, he says, I'm afraid I'm going to screw up a tool. Mm-hmm. And I looked at him, I said, you know what? You probably will.
Yeah.
But you're going to learn from that experience, and you'll learn how to recover the edge, and that's all part of the learning process. You can't be afraid of, screwing it up, because, chances are if you're beginning, you may, and you may get an edge that doesn't cut well, or is, just ugly to look at, but you've got some experience under your belt now that you can go back and try it again.
Right. And the next time is always better, it seems like.
Yep.
I remember the first time I tried to put a camber on the smoothing plane, and I put so much of a camber on it, I was maybe getting a strip of wood about a half-inch wide when I adjusted the blade out. So I learned from that one that it doesn't take much camber to do the job. So it's all a learning process. And if you don't do it, you're not going to learn.
Right. Yeah.
And even if you pick up a book on sharpening, still, if you don't actually do it, you're not going to learn.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes even some of the, not necessarily the books that you mentioned, but there are sharpening books out there that try and take an encyclopedic approach. And I wonder and question just how helpful that is. Because if you present 9,000 options for how to sharpen something, have you really helped anybody other than possibly just confused the whole issue?
Yeah, a lot of books go into the discussion of tool steels and the different types of steel, and I just basically touched on it because I figured, the reader that we're targeting is a beginner, is a do-it-yourselfer. They really aren't going to care what kind of steel their tool is made of. They just want to know if they can get it sharp.
Right.
And I briefly touch on the different types and, the types of steel they could look for, but I don't go into the metallurgy and all that stuff. It's just the process of sharpening.
Yeah. And I think there's also a sense of, I don't know, kind of a false objectivity that X steel is better than Y steel, or this sharpening medium is better than that sharpening medium. It's just more of what are you looking for in a particular tool or in a sharpening process or whatever. Like you said, there's before that there's advantages and disadvantages to each one of those.
And that is one thing I have learned over the years is that, whether if it's Japanese blue steel or, Veritas PMV11 or just a plain carbon steel blade, I've noticed in my experience there are distinct differences between those materials. The carbon steel blade is very easy to sharpen, but it doesn't hold the edge as long as maybe a PMV11 powdered metal blade or a Japanese steel blade, which the better ones are hand forged. So yes, they do make a difference, but for somebody just starting out, learning how to sharpen a tool with a high carbon steel blade will get you way ahead. And,
right.
And then from there you can, broaden your experience with some of the other tool steels.
So how about your other book, the Woodworking Basics? What led to the decision of not including power tools?
Well, again, this publisher targets home crafters and do-it-yourselfers, and so we thought, okay, if with just some basic tools like a handsaw, a hammer, some basic chisels, and maybe a portable hand drill,
sure.
Can we build some projects using just those tools? And I think we succeeded. I mean, the book seems to be selling well, but
nice.
We're targeting that audience that's looking at woodworking and going, man, I can't afford. And that's been one of my pet peeves with some of the magazines is, we always assume as writers and editors that our target audience has thousands and thousands of dollars worth of power tools in their shop. Well, that's not the case with everybody, especially somebody that's looking at the hobby going, I would like to try that, but I don't have that kind of money, nor
right.
do I have the space. Mm-hmm. And so with just a few basic tools, you can do some decent work and build some good looking projects. And that was our aim for that book.
Yeah, because it is kind of interesting. I mean, you can't start from nowhere. You have to make some assumptions on having a starting point for tools. And then again, it gets into that thing where it's like, are you being prescriptive on what you're trying to get across or descriptive on what's going on with the process? So I think, and John, we were just talking about that in relationship to projects last week with Dylan.
Yeah, just of where do you start? Do you show people how to make these big heirloom projects, or something that's more easily attainable to get those early successes that keeps them going and keeps them in the hobby, and can work your way up to those dream projects.
Prior to the pandemic, I was teaching some basic hand tool joinery classes at the Florida School of Woodwork, and my students there, the aha moments when they first realize how to properly use a handsaw and how to properly sharpen a plane and adjust it to get that shaving. I mean, one guy yelled across the room when he took his hand plane to a piece of wood and he got this wispy thin shaving is, oh my God, that's how it's supposed to work. And it's just that aha moment that these, and my argument has always been, if you don't know how to use basic hand tools and master them, then, the power tools aren't really going to help you that much. Because you have to learn the fine points of joinery and what a good joint looks like and how it's supposed to fit together and how do you get from point A to point B and what tools do you use to do that.
Right. They kind of just help you get through all that faster or do more of it. But like you said, if you don't know how to do the basics of it, then it doesn't do you much good.
And I've always advocated that even if you have a shop full of thousands of dollars of power tools, you still need to learn to master hand tools.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about, you mentioned teaching, talk about the differences between teaching through your writing and then teaching in person, and maybe where they go back and forth?
Well, teaching in person is always interesting because in most classes you have a variety of skill levels coming into the class, so you have to adjust your instruction to accommodate everybody. So, those that have, may already have experience using a hand plane, you give them exercises and tasks, that they can do while we're spending more time with the beginners to get them set up to do the same task. So it's a challenge to try to keep up, try to keep everybody on the same page.
Sure.
And then with writing, I always have to force myself. I know how to do what I'm writing about, but I have to step back and look at, okay, the reader may not have a clue what I'm talking about. So how do I describe what I'm doing and show what I'm doing in steps that make sense, to somebody that's never done that before?
Sure.
In a classroom environment, you can demo, the procedure. You can demo how to use a handsaw. You can demo how to properly set up a hand plane, and then ask the students to go back to their benches and do some exercises to put those into practice. But with writing, you have to rely on photos and illustrations, and that's where I always thought, Woodsmith did an excellent job. My dad subscribed to Woodsmith since day one, and that's where I learned a lot of my woodworking, is looking at his copies of the magazine, and I was always impressed with the photos and the illustrations that broke down the processes to be able to accomplish those projects, and it was a big help.
Yeah. I mean, in a class too, you can see it when somebody gets it, or
right.
on their face when they're not really getting it.
And even in the classroom, I have to force myself to step back and say, okay, they don't know how to properly hold a handsaw. They don't know how to start the cut.
Yeah.
I do that just automatically, but I have to step back and realize that they don't know how to do that. So I have to show them, so as an instructor, you have to assume that what you're trying to illustrate, they have no experience with whatsoever. So what are the steps to get them going with the tool and proper technique?
Right. So now, before you came to Woodsmith, you had a certain amount of woodworking and home improvement background, because I remember hearing several stories of an addition you built on the back of your house.
Right. My dad was a handyman, so I would help him with projects while I was growing up, and I took woodworking projects in 4-H, if anybody knows what that is anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he would help me with some of those projects. And then as I got older, I'd start building things on my own. And then when I got married, I started to put together my own shop. My first workshop was in a basement, and I built a workbench out of 2x4s and a sheet of plywood. And I put a piece of masonite or hardboard on top of that so that I could replace it if I needed to. And then I had a Woodsmith built router table.
Okay.
And a circular saw and a handheld router and a portable drill. And that was it. I had no drill press, no bandsaw, no joiner, no planer. But I would go to the lumber yard and say, I want these boards, but can you plane them down for me? That was back in the day when the lumber yard would be happy to accommodate you, and they'd run them through the planer to whatever thickness you needed, and that was a big help. But I built a lot of projects in that first shop, and as a matter of fact, I ended up remodeling our entire kitchen in our first house with just those basic tools. But then we moved from there into a rural area in a 1.5-story house that some of my friends said should have been torn down. But we went in and gutted it and put in all new mechanicals and everything. And I have 7 boys. So a story and a half house with 2 bedrooms wasn't going to cut it. So we eventually designed our own addition, and we essentially tripled the square footage of the existing house by putting this addition on. And I did a lot of the framing, and I did all the electrical myself, all the plumbing myself, and I have tons of stories I could tell about that. But I learned a lot, and surprisingly, I did pass the plumbing inspection and the electrical inspection first time out. So I was pretty proud of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like anytime I've ever done plumbing, and it might be the simplest thing, it's like 10 trips to the store of like getting the parts that finally fit and don't leak, and so it's always a journey.
And you're afraid to take back what you've already bought because you may need it later.
Right, yeah. Yes.
I've purchased a variety of these things over the last year and a half, and now that the house is done, I don't think I need them. Can I bring them back still?
Yeah.
Well, I remember one of the stories that you told was, I don't remember if it was the kitchen remodel or as part of the addition, where you had done the cabinets using a molding head cutter on the table saw.
That was in my first house.
Okay.
Yep, I had a Sears Craftsman table saw. I forgot to mention that. I did have a Sears Craftsman table saw, and the molding head for that, where you could have 3 replaceable cutters. And I made all the rails and stiles for the cabinet doors using that. And I don't know why they're not more prevalent, because it did a great job, and it was, relatively inexpensive.
Right.
But it worked great for me. I mean, it's, you had the cope and stick profiles and glue them together and put a panel in them, and it's, you're done. It was great.
Yeah. Yeah. For people who are not aware of it, it's an interesting tool because it's kind of like the unholy offspring of a dado blade and router bits.
And it scares the crap out of you when you first turn the saw on. You hear this.
Yeah, there's a unique hum to it so it's basically a large steel disc that attaches to your saw just like a table saw blade, but you have 3 interchangeable cutters that you can use, and you can get in a variety of profiles. So it's not just joinery. Like you can do, I think there's a rabbiting one and a variety of, basically like router profiles, OGs and roundovers and coves.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's still making those or not. I thought there was one manufacturer left, but I'm not sure they're around.
I believe they still are. The Korob Cutter, I think, is the company. If they are, I'll put a link to it on the show notes page for the website. I'll also have links for Randy's books if you're interested in checking those out as well. So, yeah, so it was, for me, when you came in as an editor, it was kind of fun to have your perspective on, because it seemed like a lot of the people that we worked with, they were either professional woodworkers or, I guess more like professional woodworkers or designers. And then you and I were kind of the hobbyist slum dogs that were just doing it because we loved it.
Yeah, it's always been an enjoyable hobby for me, and you make mistakes, and sometimes when you make a mistake, you just have to put your tools down and go inside and turn the TV on. But overall, it's an enjoyable hobby if you're able to, step back and take your time and do a good job and not feel rushed. I've taken on some paid projects where you get 3/4 of the way through it and you're just like, I'm ready for this to be done. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of sort of rush through things, and then you make mistakes and joints don't fit right. And, I'm always having to force myself to take a deep breath, step back, force myself to slow down, and, just take my time, because that's the only way you're going to get good results.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm more of a power tool guy, so it's when I make mistakes, I have to go in and change my pants and go take a break and get away from the tools for a little bit.
Yeah.
When I'm rushing through and things might get a little hairy. So
So what do you remember about your time at Woodsmith and ShopNotes now that you've had a good long interval to decompress?
Oh, it was a great experience. I mean, I actually, in a lot of ways hated leaving there because, I got to get up every morning and go to work and talk about woodworking and write about woodworking, and everybody there was a woodworker, and it was just great, camaraderie, in the shop to be able to watch a project being built and to discuss with the designers different options for joinery and bug the designers, John.
mm-hmm.
Why did you design it that way? And
I don't know.
but yeah, it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from the other woodworkers. Because we sometimes have blinders on about the way we like to do things, and
Sure.
to be able to see a variety of techniques from different people was a good education for me.
Mm-hmm.
Any particular events or stories that stand out to you?
I remember one time I had just started there, and Steve Johnson was one of the craftsmen in the shop. And at that time, he was big into Japanese hand planes and had a broad selection of them. And so he and I would talk hand planes a lot and just kind of banter back and forth. But one day I walked into the shop and I tried to strike up a conversation with him, and he didn't respond. And then after a few seconds, he looked at me. He says, "I am in the middle of a glue up. I'll talk to you later." So I learned that anytime somebody's gluing up a project, you just back away and let them be until it's clamped and
Stressful
done.
situation.
Yes.
No, I do know that Mark and Steve now, that's woodworking in a fishbowl in the sense that, there's constantly people around and you're trying to do top-notch work.
And for me, that would bug me.
Mm-hmm.
I would be self-conscious, if people were always walking by and looking at what I'm doing.
Right.
That's just the way I am. But by the same token, it's an opportunity to open up a conversation about why you're doing it that way. And,
Sure.
and the other thing I learned too was how to apply spray apply lacquer. That was a good experience. I had some experience with that at a prior job, with spraying on finishes, but
Yeah.
It's a little bit different when you're talking a piece of furniture.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely getting to the finish is definitely the stressful part, because you've gotten that far and you don't want to screw it up at that point. So,
And can I just say here publicly in front of the world, I hate finishing.
that's fair. That's fair.
It's a safe place.
Yeah.
If it's not an oil and wax finish,
Yeah.
count me out.
No, because I think there's a element of it that you don't want to screw up the project by misapplication, but I think there's also one of the jobs of finish is to highlight everything you've screwed up until this point as well.
Right.
Whether it's like, oh crap, I didn't get the glue out of that little seam there, didn't I?
I must have had glue on my thumb when I put those pieces together.
Yep. Fingerprints.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's once you get finish on, it's definitely hard to go back. It's hard to remove that or fix the mistakes after the finish has gone on, and just kind of live with it.
The last project I did that was a paying project before I left Iowa was to build some cabinets above this townhome had some recessed areas, and they wanted some cabinets to go in these little nooks. And they wanted them to match the existing cabinetry.
Sure.
So I built the cabinets, and I probably spent a week trying to track down finishes that would match the existing finish. And, I'd actually taken a drawer front off and taken it to the stores and said, here's what I'm trying to match. So I go and I apply all the stain and get everything done. I deliver the cabinets, and there is no way in the world they're going to match. And the customer was not happy, and
Sure.
I had to rebuild the cabinets. And that was the last time I put a finish on a paying job, and I will never do it again, not for a paying client.
Yeah.
If they want to finish it, I will build the project.
Yeah.
But the finish is one of the things where they have this idea in their mind,
Right.
and you can never attain that because you can't see it. And
Right.
so no matter what you bring them, it's not
never
right.
going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
because even if you have the exact finish, the wood might be a little different, or the other
Exactly.
thing has aged a little bit and changed the color slightly, and it's almost impossible to match.
So considering where you are now and the fact that you've started setting up another workshop space, what are some of the things that you would advise somebody who's starting out in terms of setting up a shop space? Is there something that you wish you could go back in time to early woodworking Randy and advised him to have started a little bit differently, or maybe?
I think I would have bought a bandsaw sooner
Yeah.
because it's a pretty versatile tool. The other thing I would say is learn to use and master the tools that you have, because you can do a lot with just basic tools. If all you have is a contractor's table saw, learn how to use it and get the accuracy out of it by building a sled for it, or purchasing an aftermarket miter gauge. Maximize the use of the tools that you already have, and then as you build projects, you can kind of determine what your next tool purchase would be. Now, like for me, I have never owned a joiner.
Right.
Because number one, I didn't have room for it, and number two, most of my cuts off the table saw are pretty straight, so I would just use a hand plane or a joiner plane, a number 6 or 7, and 2 swipes, I've got the saw marks removed, and I'm ready for a glue up. So
Yeah.
I've never found a jointer to be that necessary for the type of projects I build.
Yeah.
When I moved, I had to sell my planer, so I think for my shop right now, my next purchase is going to be probably a benchtop planer. But one thing I learned in writing my books, and especially targeting the DIY market, is the goal has been, what can you go to your local home center and purchase as far as lumber and build from that. So quite frankly, the last few years I've been purchasing surface 4-side lumber from the home center and building projects with that. Yeah, it's a little pricey,
Right.
compared to what you could get from a lumber yard, but don't discount that as an option. I think, Phil, you understand my love for poplar because it's easy to machine and it's easy
Sure.
to use hand tools on, but I like the looks of it. You get
Yeah.
some of that green in there and you leave it sit out in the sun for a day or two, and it gets that nice golden brown color. I've just fallen in love with poplar, and it's one of the least inexpensive woods there is.
Yeah.
And if you want to build a project, build it with poplar first to see how, to master the joinery and get it done. And you may end up just liking it the way it is, instead of using, a fancier hardwood like walnut, cherry, oak, or, whatever.
Right.
But yeah, and in my classes I taught, we used poplar because it was easy to work with.
Sure.
And it's inexpensive. So, yeah, I would say, get the basic tools, but learn how to master those and figure out what it is you need to purchase next. And what's your budget? What kind of space do you have? In some ways I envy these guys that have, 2,000 square foot shops and, all kinds of storage space and every tool known to man. But, the reality is I don't think that's very representative of a lot of woodworkers. I mean, a lot of woodworkers are working out of a spare room in their apartment or a half a garage, So how do you accomplish these great looking projects in a limited amount of space with a limited budget and with a limited tool set? It is possible, but you have to think outside the box and learn how to master the tools that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And also kind of realize that, I think because there's sort of popular fun articles to write of X tools that you need to start woodworking. And I think, we've both discovered, or all of us have discovered, that you can probably get started building stuff with a lot fewer tools than you think.
Right.
And that there's always going to be a journey, not trying to think that there's a perfect starting line to start from, or that you've arrived necessarily at a shop. You're, over the course of your time as a woodworker, you've acquired and discarded probably an equal a number of tools that you either, found that you really wanted or realized you didn't need.
Well, that's the other piece of advice I guess I'd give too, is if you're starting out and you're looking to purchase tools, purchase the best that you can afford, because buying something inexpensive is going to lead to frustration and trying to get it to work the way it's supposed to. Just take a hand plane, for example. You can go to the home center and buy a hand plane, but how much time are you going to spend tuning it up and trying to get it to work when you can go and purchase a better quality plane for, a little more money? But then now you've got a tool that's a lifetime investment. You don't have to buy that tool again, ever.
Right.
And once you learn to set it up and use it, you'll appreciate, the quality. So that's one thing too, is don't cheap out on tools.
So you said you've been getting a lot of wood from home centers. In Central Florida, they have like woodworking stores, like the Woodsmith store here in Des Moines, or places to buy other kinds of wood or specialty tools.
There are a few woodcraft stores scattered about, and in other parts of the state there are some Rockler stores. But we have quite a selection of lumber yards here that get anything you want, really.
Sure.
And are happy to mill it for you and do all that. So, we're not at a lack for good quality hardwoods.
Sure. Is there something, or is there materials that are more prevalent in Florida that we don't find here in Iowa, or just they have pretty much everything?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything. They've got a few more exotics, I guess, than you might find up north, but they can get just about anything.
So is there any branch of woodworking that you could see yourself trying out in the next few years, or that you have an interest in?
Well, I've always been a fan of shaker style furniture, and I would like to build some pieces that I don't have to sell or use as demos for a class or something, that I can actually keep and put in my home. One of the problems with being a woodworker is you're always building stuff for somebody else, and you don't get to keep what you build. So
yeah,
and I like the shaker style furniture, number one, because it's simplicity in design, and number two, it's the Shakers were practical people. They built a piece to be practical and useful. And then number three, most Shaker pieces lend themselves well to working with hand tools.
Sure.
Sure, I'll use a bandsaw to cut a taper, but I'm going to use a hand plane to smooth it out. So I'll use a combination of tools, but I enjoy the opportunities I get to use my hand tools.
Yeah.
I appreciate the quiet. I appreciate the accuracy they give, and the resulting finish. So, my dad, growing up watching him, he was a power tool guy.
Sure.
Because he was paid to get the job done. And, if he needed to take a 30-second off the end of a board to get it to fit somewhere, he would take it back to the table saw and nip it off. He had a hand plane. The only time I saw him use a hand plane at all was a little block plane to trim the edge of a door to get it to fit.
Yeah.
And, so for him, that was foreign, that you would use a hand plane in carpentry.
Where did the hand tool bug catch you then? Because even when you came to Woodsmith and ShopNotes, you were kind of the hand tool guy.
Well, I've always seen these magazine articles, and especially one particular magazine that shall remain nameless, that always featured these guys using these hand planes, and it was just foreign to me. It's like, why? What's the attraction? And then one Christmas, my dad showed up at the house for our family get-together, and he came in carrying this paper bag, and he said, "I found these in the shop. I thought you might get some use out of them." And I opened it up, and there was a number 4.5 Stanley smoothing plane and a number 78 Rabbit plane.
Oh, wow.
I looked at those, and I looked at him, and I said, "What am I supposed to do with these?" So I just started doing my own research. I got online, and then the eBay bug hit. Mm-hmm. And I started buying all these hand planes off of eBay back when the prices were still pretty reasonable.
Right.
And so I got a selection of hand planes, but I found myself enjoying the process of restoring a tool almost as enjoyable as building a project.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So I figured out how to, I took my dad's planes apart, cleaned them, read online how you're supposed to make sure the frog's flat and how you adjust the frog and, flatten the sole and all that stuff. And, I'm brand new at this, so I'm just kind of winging it. And then I finally got the thing sharpened and got it put back together and took my first pass and got this shaving rolling off, and I go, now I get it.
Sure.
And that's what changed my direction of woodworking. And the next occurrence where that happened was when I purchased a shoulder plane. When you're trying to fit joinery together and you need to shave off a few thousandths of an inch to get that joint to fit just right. Shoulder plane's a perfect tool, and it's like, where have you been all my life? I mean, it completely changed my woodworking because it made it that much more accurate. Mm-hmm. So, that I had no formal instruction in hand plane usage. It was I'm all self-taught and everything, but the process of doing that, I've learned a lot, and now I'm teaching people how to do that for themselves, and I just get a lot of enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, coming from someone like me that uses a lot of power tools, it's definitely hard to, if like you have a joint that's really close but not quite there, if you take it back to a power tool, you could easily take off 1/8 of an inch, and it's way too much, and now you have a joint that's too loose. Whereas if you can grab a shoulder plane and just take off a 64th or whatever and sneak up on that fit, it's a lot easier.
Two bench accessories that I've found quite useful are a bench hook mm-hmm. and a shooting board.
Yep.
For shooting the end grain of a piece of wood before you cut the joinery, and then fine tuning the fit. It's just all stuff you learn and appreciate as a hand tool user.
Definitely.
Sure.
So neither one of you have mentioned, the fact that I look like.
I was just getting to that, actually.
I didn't even notice.
That you've developed kind of a side hustle these last couple of years.
Yeah, a couple of years ago we were at a restaurant it was Christmas Eve, And I have a red hat that I wear that's like this, that has a little white ball on top and some white fur around the edge. And so I wear that in public sometimes. And we were standing in line waiting to be seated at this restaurant. And this 4-year-old girl saw me from about 20 feet away. She comes running over to me, and she's just jumping up and down. She goes, "You're Santa Claus." I go, "Yes, I am." So I played along. And she goes, "I'm going to leave you cookies and milk, and I'm going to write you a note." And I said, "Oh, I love cookies, you know." And then she stopped. She got real serious. She looks up at me, and she goes, "Who are you?" I said, "Well, who do you think I am?" She goes, "You're Santa Claus." And her parents are standing back. They're just enjoying the moment, you know. And
Sure.
And coincidentally, a cousin of mine, her husband had passed away, and he had portrayed Santa Claus, and she sent me his suit.
Oh.
So last year, I did my first public appearance at a city event here, where people could come up and get photos taken with Santa and all that. And then because of COVID, I decided I wasn't going to do any live events beyond that. And I got hooked up with a company that did virtual visits online.
Oh.
And so for the months of November and December, I ended up talking to 600 kids around the world, and I had a blast.
Cool.
It was great. So, and even now, there's a couple neighbor kids that swear I'm Santa. they just, every time I go out, "Hi, Santa!" And the one little boy, I'll go, "You're being good, aren't you?" "Yeah." So I get these random kids coming up to me all the time, asking if I'm Santa, and of course I am.
Yep.
To them, I am. So it's a lot of fun.
It's awesome.
I think it's kind of funny because I always got the idea that Santa was basically a November and December kind of gig, and there's no off season for you.
Nope, there isn't.
I don't know if you remember this, but years ago, you kind of took offense once to a time you were jogging on a trail not far from your house, past an apartment complex, and a couple of alcohol lubricated young folk had called you Santa from a distance.
Yeah, that was back when I had gained quite a bit of weight, and I was trying to take it off. And so I'd taken to jogging.
Right.
And I took offense at them calling me Santa because I inferred from that they were talking about my weight more so than my beard.
Sure.
But yeah, it's, since my beard has gotten whiter, I thought, why not?
Right. Got to own it.
So I let it go and let it grow and got the Santa thing going now, and we're getting ramped up for this season. And I'm meeting with a fellow Santa tomorrow, actually, to believe it or not, there are professional associations of Santa portrayers. So I belong to several Facebook groups that guys that portray Santa. And don't forget Mrs. Claus.
Right.
So yes, that's my side gig when I'm not doing woodworking stuff.
All right. So there you are. If you're in the Florida area and you see Santa, ask him if he does woodworking too. So, Randy, I appreciate you coming and appearing on the show.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that wraps it up for another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. As always, you can watch the podcast on our YouTube channel. You can also check out our show notes page that we have on our website, woodsmith.com/podcasts. You'll find the ShopNotes Podcast at all the local podcasteries that are out there. So feel free to subscribe, and we love it when you give us good reviews because that helps the podcast get out to more woodworkers. Feel free to share it as well. If you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks, you can send those in either in the comments section on our YouTube channel or email us, woodsmith@woodsmith.com. Just a reminder that today's episode was brought to you by Shaper Tools. They're the makers of the Shaper Origin. It's that handheld CNC that allows you to bring digital precision to your woodworking. You can do everything from joinery, cabinetry, hardware installation, and more with speed and precision. Right now, they're offering a special risk-free option where you can try it in your shop for 30 days. You just check out shapertools.com to find out the details. Otherwise, we'll see you next week on the ShopNotes Podcast. Bye, everybody.